much.
Well, we're still seeing both parties really play to their bases right now. For Democrats, they're fresh off this victory in the midterm elections, and they see no reason to start negotiating or offering $1 for the wall. Or actually, in fact, the other day, Nancy Pelosi suggested she would be willing to give President Trump $1 for the wall, but probably not much more than that.
Aside from the events of the shutdown, a couple other things going on this week. Gun control, or at least gun-type legislation expected this week on the Hill. Tell us what's going to happen.
That's right. So today is actually the 8-year anniversary of former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords when she was shot in the head at a constituent event, and to this day, she really struggled to recover from that grievous injury. So she'll be back on Capitol Hill today with Speaker Pelosi and gun control advocates for a bill to require universal background checks for gun purchases. And this really shows what a priority this has become for the Democratic Party and how mainstream gun control has become for rank-and-file Democrats. Because this is already, they've actually named it H.R. 8, and, to correspond with the 8-year anniversary. But this shows you what a top priority this has become. And you even saw a lot of Democratic candidates, even in competitive districts, campaign on gun control.
Talk about the approach then of focusing on background checks versus other things under the gun control umbrella.
Well, gun control or background checks are something that can be a little bit more bipartisan. In fact, Congressman Peter King, who's a Republican from New York, has endorsed similar legislation to this in the past. And this is something that can garner pretty much unanimous support from Democrats as well, and they can pick up a fair amount of support from some Republican quarters compared to something like ban on assault rifles, for example. So
as far as the vote itself, is it expected that Republicans largely will sign on to this, or will there be resistance?
There may be some resistance, but Democrats should be able to pick up at least a fair amount of Republicans.
From our line for Democrats, we'll hear from Keith. He's in Chicago. You're next up. Go ahead.
Good morning, and I'd like to start a trend by saying to this reporter, thank you for your service, particularly in this fact-free era when we have a whole political party that rejects facts and preference of personality, cult of personality. That said, one thing I learned in J school was objectivity. But let's be objective here. This president has a pattern of not misstating, not making gaffes, of outright lying to us, the people of America, the majority of whom, and I'd like you reporters to please always remember this, it was a split decision. The referendum, the majority of people didn't want him, his wall, or anything. All right? The majority of the American people. So you can't dismiss the popular vote. You have to take that into account because that's our sentiment.
So, caller, with that in mind, what would you like our guest to specifically address?
Yes. Why should the Democrats give $1 when the mantra was, what are we going to do? Build a wall. Who's paying for it? Mexico. It's null and void after that.
Okay, thanks, caller.
But yes, as I was saying, Nancy Pelosi did half-jokingly suggest the other day she'd be okay with $1 for the wall, which obviously wouldn't get the President Trump very far in building a wall on the Mexican border. But right now, Democrats don't see any reason after this fresh midterm victory to really give President Trump much of anything at this stage. But also, you have to bear in mind that this shutdown began right before Christmas. They let lawmakers go home for the holiday. No one was really here for a couple of weeks. So really, it's not until this week's and end of last week that we've really started to see the usual cycle of these fights begin to play out.
As far as what history tells us, when do Democrats then become uncomfortable with what's going on concerning the shutdown, particularly those who aren't going to work day in, day out?
I think we'll really start to see the pressure go up this Friday when these hundreds of thousands of federal workers won't get that paycheck that they would have been getting if there weren't a shutdown. Because until now, it was kind of sleepy with the holidays. A lot of people weren't paying attention. But now people are really starting to see and feel the effects of this shutdown.
Virginia, in Lynchburg, we'll hear from Richard, Republican line. You're on with our guest. Good morning.
Yes, how you doing today? How you doing today?
Go on, sir, you're on. Go ahead.
Yes. You know, we're all talking about the shutdown, and we're all talking we want our jobs back. Well, you know, we got some problems that we need to really take care of right now about the environment. You know, the oceans are rising. Well, everybody says that's just normal. Well, it's not normal because way back when there wasn't any cars, there wasn't any pollution, and that's why that there wasn't that problem of the melting icebergs and stuff. There wasn't any bad atmosphere.
So, caller, we're talking specifically about the government shutdown. You may be referencing the previous segment, but
I know that's what I'm getting to.
Go ahead.
We ought to open the government back up and get people talking about the environment and the edge of like New York City and all of the big cities. We need to build a wall around America to keep the water out. And we need to get all those people involved in doing it and starting it now because of all the pollution and all the people and all the coal burning that's going on.
Gotcha, caller, gotcha. Reporting on your website, the Hill website, saying when it comes to Democrats and their efforts this week, 3 bills to be considered: the Agricultural Department, the Food and Drug Administration, the Interior Department. Why those 3?
Well, those are agencies that really, I mean, all government agencies affect Americans' lives, whether they necessarily see a direct impact or not. But something like agriculture, food stamps are a program that falls under that department's umbrella. And right now, the agency has estimated that they have enough to cover recipients for this month, but it's unclear that they'll have enough for February. And if this shutdown goes on long enough, we could see a situation where they have to pick and choose potentially between who is receiving food stamps will be able to get them and who's going to be able to eat in February if this shutdown goes on for that long.
When it comes to areas like justice or law enforcement or TSA, what's the coverage like as far as the ability for people to keep working without paychecks, and will those be considered as far as legislation is concerned?
Well, that's something that lawmakers actually will. They're actually kind of folks who use airports all the time, and they have to travel back and forth multiple times a week to and from Washington. And so seeing the effects of the shutdown on TSA agents who, there was a CNN report last week saying a lot of them have been calling in sick while they've been working without pay. And that's something that lawmakers will actually be able to see up close in their own day-to-day lives compared to some other programs where maybe that doesn't necessarily affect their day-to-day lives.
Independent line, this is Thomas. Thomas, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Good morning. This is Thomas, Charleston, Illinois. A lot of times in this world of double talk, we say to ourselves and each other that this and that doesn't make any sense. But actually, it often does make a sinister sense from a sinister perspective. For instance, the wall makes little to no sense. And the shutdown is worse than not making any sense. It is sadistic and sinister. But it makes sense from this perspective. The one person or one entity that it benefits most is Putin in Russia. Shut down the USA government, Trump, in every way that you possibly can. And Trump is obliging Putin by shutting down the USA government.
Okay, caller, we'll go to Aaron in Torrance, California, Democrats line.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you go into a room to negotiate, but if you already have your mind made up, there's not negotiating. I mean, the Democrat went in to negotiate, and they said, well, got to have my $5 billion. Oh, there's nothing. That's not negotiation. You need to go in with somewhat of an open mind and discuss it, and you might come up with something. But if you go up to somebody that already had their mind made up, you already feel like there's no reason to spend any time talking with them. That is my opinion of the situation.
Christina Marcos, as far as the ability for either side to give in, at least to keep talking about the situation, to open the government, where do we stand on those fronts?
Well, over the weekend, Vice President Pence and Representatives for Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer met over in the White House complex to talk about the situation, but even over on Saturday and Sunday, they weren't able to reach any sort of real progress. But right now, there aren't even any other meetings scheduled. We're not even seeing, any more face-to-face meetings that are on the docket at this moment, which tells you both how little progress was made over the weekend and how the stalemate remains a total impasse.
The president declaring a national emergency, or potentially declaring a national emergency as far as border wall funding. What impact, how is that resonating on Capitol Hill, that announcement over the last, that possible announcement coming up?
Well, that's something that Democrats have indicated. If President Trump were to declare a national emergency and bypass Congress to try to start building a wall, they're indicating that they would immediately challenge it, and this could end up filing lawsuits, and this would get mired in the legal system, and they would question the constitutionality and the legality of being able to make such a move. But we likely wouldn't just see Democrats who would be howling over this. I mean, Republicans in Congress, they're also part of what's supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, and to see the president do something like that, completely go over the heads of Congress, that's likely not going to sit well with a lot of people.
Is that particularly on the House side or the Senate side you may see more of that resistance?
I would think you would see more of that resistance in the Senate, just because individual senators have more power than individual House members. And we'll also see more senators who are willing to be more critical of President Trump, especially the House Republican Conference right now is much more pro-Trump than it was before the election, because a lot of the reason why there's a Democratic majority is because there are a lot of more centrist Republicans who retired or they lost re-election.
Don't forget the president makes that announcement, or at least the address tonight, about 8 or 9 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes as our guest had said. That will be at 9 o'clock. You can see that on C-SPAN. You can go to cspan.org for that. Also our C-SPAN radio app. Let's go to Portland, Oregon. We'll hear from Lynn. Lynn, thanks for calling. You're on the line. Go ahead.
I would like to see it brought up more often that in the past, the Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, have voted to build a wall. And I'd also like to bring up that it's not a horrible thing to have a wall in place, at least in portions. We had the effects of a wall when Ellis Island was in effect in the early part of the last century, that in effect refused different people coming over entrance if they had disease or other problems. And we know walls work. We all have doors with locks. We have a wall around the White House, a fence. You can call it many different names, and it doesn't have to be a solid wall, and I don't think that's what's intended. We just need some common sense here, and I believe it's not being had, and it's just everybody's dug into their own trench and doesn't want to listen to anyone else.
Okay, thanks. Oops, sorry, caller, about that. Ms. Marcos.
Well, the caller's right that it's a lot of lawmakers are saying that it's not really just about a physical barrier. I mean, there are in fact parts of the U.S.-Mexico border where there are physical barriers, but what a lot of lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, who represent districts that are actually along the border and they have firsthand knowledge of these issues, are saying that you need a mixture of different policies and approaches, like having more drones or employing more Border Patrol agents or other strategies like that versus just a simple barrier. And in fact, this is something that some of President Trump's core supporters have worried about, that yes, they really want the wall and they really want President Trump to push for it, but there's also some concern that in the push for a physical barrier that may or may not be the most practical solution would encourage the president to cut a deal with Democrats that includes allowing more immigrants who are undocumented to come into this country.
With the incoming of House Democrats taking power, also new committee chairmanships, what are the ones to watch as far as committees themselves and the people running them?
Well, the key committees that will be to be watched in this new Congress, for sure, the House Oversight Committee. That's where we're going to see the bulk of these really key investigations that Republicans declined to take up while they were in power. Chairman Elijah Cummings has really made clear there's a lot he wants to do, a lot he has planned, and also the House Judiciary Committee. That's a place where, if it were to come up, that's where impeachment proceedings would begin. And
that will be run by Gerald Nadler, Democrat from New York. Any sense of what we should expect from him now that he's running it?
Well, he has always been very much in the camp of impeachment should be considered as a nuclear option, that there needs to be a long investigation and process for building up to something like that. And he's also been of the camp, like as everyone else in House Democratic leadership, that the best thing to do is wait for Special Counsel Robert Mueller to finish his report and to see what he says before Democrats move forward with anything like that.
With the progressives being elected in the House, will they be comfortable with that sentiment or that idea of waiting for the Mueller report, or waiting or using impeachment as a last resort?
Well, they've been calling or agitating for impeachment for a long time because they are responding to their base that just wants to see President Trump out of office. But I was talking with Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who's actually the chair of the Financial Services Committee now, the other day, and she was saying that, look, like, they recognize that when they're calling for impeachment, it doesn't mean that it needs to happen tomorrow, but it means that they should start. They know that there needs to be investigations and hearings and everything else, but they just want that process to be as soon as possible.
Let's hear one more call. This is from Mark in Kentucky. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Good morning. I would like to comment on the border wall. There is a contract that has been let to a construction company in Texas to build 6 miles of wall, $145 million, which comes to $24 million a mile. This contract has already been let, and it will start in February. And, you know, that's outrageous. $24 million a mile, 18 feet high, made of concrete. If you will Google border wall contractors, this is a fact. This contract has already been let by the Corps of Engineers, and to start in February. And it's impossible to put a wall, 18-foot high concrete wall. This is already, the construction will start in February. $24 million a mile.
Gotcha, Mark. Thank you. Let's start let's end where we started. What are you watching for this week? What's most important for people to watch this week?
Well, with all the votes that House Democrats are putting on the floor for individual bills to open up different parts of the government, last week we saw 7 House Republicans break with their party and vote with Democrats. The thing to watch to see if that number goes up or goes down as the Trump administration puts on even more pressure starting tonight on House Republicans to stay in line.
One of the people following that, Christina Marcos of The Hill. She serves as a congressional reporter. If you want to see her reporting, thehill.com is the website where you can find that. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
We're about 10 minutes away from President Trump and his address to the nation. The administration says it'll be on the humanitarian and national security crisis on the southern border. This is the president's first address from the Oval Office. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer will respond at the conclusion of the president's remarks. Live coverage beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Wednesday morning, we'll discuss the government shutdown's impact on federal workers with Federal News Network's Nicole Ogrisso. And Virginia Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly also weighs in on the government shutdown. Then Nebraska Republican Congressman Don Bacon joins us to talk about border security. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 Eastern Wednesday morning. Join the discussion.
Live Wednesday morning at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Questions to the Prime Minister.
The British House of Commons returns from holiday break for the first Prime Minister's Questions of 2019. Watch Prime Minister's Questions live Wednesday morning at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Texas voters elected 9 new members of Congress during the midterms, 5 of them Republicans. Dan Crenshaw is a former Navy SEAL who lost an eye to an IED in Afghanistan. He was born in Scotland and spent some of his childhood in South America, where his father worked in the oil industry. Voters in the 5th District elected Lance Gooden, who has also served in the state legislature. He was an insurance broker for energy companies prior to his election. Chip Roy is a former U.S. Senate staffer, having worked for Senator John Cornyn and as the first chief of staff for Senator Ted Cruz. He also worked for then-Governor Rick Perry, even ghostwriting a book for the governor. Mr. Roy has also been a federal prosecutor. Van Taylor now represents the state's 3rd District. He was previously a member of the Texas state legislature, serving terms in both the State House and Senate. Before his political career, Representative Taylor saw combat in Iraq as a member of the U.S. Marine Corps. And in the 6th District, Ron Wright succeeded Congressman Joe Barton, for whom he'd once worked as both Chief of Staff and District Director. Earlier in his career, he was on the City Council of Arlington, Texas. New Congress, new leaders. Watch it all on C-SPAN. Ahead of President Trump's address to the nation, House Republicans were briefed about security on the southern border by Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and Vice President Mike Pence. Here are GOP leaders.
Well, hi, everybody. We had a very good meeting just now with the Vice President, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Acting OMB Director. The main message and focus is the fact that we have a crisis at the southern border. Nobody denies we have a crisis at the southern border. It's absolutely clear it's a humanitarian crisis and it's a security crisis, and we've got to ensure we provide the resources necessary. The President has been and continues to negotiate in good faith. He's giving an address this evening. It's the first time he's given an address from the Oval Office. It shows you the importance of the issue. And at the same time, however, we're in a situation where even though we have provided the information that the Democrats have asked for in terms of detailing what the resources are necessary to use for, they have not responded. They have not come back to us. They've refused to negotiate. So we are absolutely dedicated to making sure that we secure the border and stop the political games, stop the partisan games. And the Vice President was received very warmly and was able to give everybody a very clear idea of where the President stands and his commitment on this issue. So with that, I will turn it over to the whip.
Thank you, Liz. We have a clear crisis at the southern border. I appreciate the fact that President Trump has a strong resolve to solve this crisis while working to reopen the government. What we have seen from Pelosi and Schumer are a refusal to negotiate. This goes back to weeks ago when we passed a bill out of the House to fully fund the remaining agencies of the federal government while solving the crisis at the southern border. That bill went over to the Senate. The president immediately started to offer a negotiation with Chuck Schumer. They started talking numbers through the vice president, and yet not one day did you see a counter offer. Vice President Pence did a great job of addressing our conference to explain how serious this crisis is and to talk about the numbers. The numbers are astounding. They're alarming. I'm sure President Trump's going to go into some of that tonight. But just last year, over 17,000 people with prior criminal convictions tried to cross the southern border and were caught. Those are just the ones we caught, by the way. How many more got through because we don't have a secure border? That's what this is all about. We want to get the entire government reopened while securing the border. You can't have one without the other. You can't say you're for border security and then refuse to support the very things it's going to take to secure the border. These aren't numbers from the president. These are numbers from the experts who are tasked with keeping our country safe, who want to keep our country safe but don't have the tools they need. We're going to see tonight how serious this crisis is at the border, but we've got to get this problem solved. We've got to reopen the government while securing the border. That's what this battle's all about. Leader.
You just had an update from our conference. It was a very positive conference. From the Vice President to the Secretary of Homeland talked about the crisis down at the border, but more importantly, this President, from the day of this partial shutdown was to begin, has been trying to negotiate to an agreement that can keep government open, but more importantly, solve our border problem. When we met last week on last Wednesday, we couldn't get to a point because we didn't have our leadership races done. People had challenges with that. You watched how close some of these leadership races were, so I guess that made a difference. So we waited to come back on Friday. We made some improvement. And in that improvement, we stayed over the weekend. We had staff in there. This is the time to actually solve this problem before we get to the point where federal employees do not get paid. The president is committed to that, to try to solve that problem while keeping the border secure. In those meetings at the White House, every single person says they're for border security. Then you want to ask the definition of border security. That's the fundamental difference. When I watch the floor, it seems like it's more games because those bills are going nowhere in the Senate. Leader McConnell has already said so. The president said he'd veto it. Now is the time to both sides come together, come to an agreement, especially if all sides say they support border security, and find common ground to make sure the rest of government opens back up and we continue to move forward and end the crisis on our border. The president will speak tonight. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. I hope the American people at the same time will be able to listen and find that this president wants to solve this problem, not like others.
Mr.
Yes.
Leader, did the vice president, did they give any indication whether the president was going to order a national emergency?
They did not touch that topic. The president, I think we'll all be listening tonight to hear where the president wants to go.
And do you have concerns if they were? Because under President Obama, your side was very concerned, always saying we need to exercise our Article I authority. Would you be okay if the president went that way and went around Congress?
Look, I've watched this president and the number of meetings I have been in with him, with the Democrats on the other side. I've watched the Speaker of the House first interrupt the secretary, wouldn't let her give her own presentation. Then, as we continue these meetings days later, when the secretary finally has the ability to give facts out, she says, I disagree with the facts. Well, they're not the secretary facts. They're the facts that are happening along the border. That's the challenge what we have. We have individuals who say they don't want to talk about anything, even though they say they believe in border security. This is the time to put people before politics, stop playing political games, and this president has worked day in and day out. He stayed here during the process, trying to make sure people came together, find common ground. But this is something the president ran on. This is something the American public understands. We have a crisis on our border, and we have to solve that problem at the same time, make sure government opens back up. Thank you. Hey, I apologize. I don't control the floor anymore.
Is it possible to secure the border without a wall?
Look, the president has talked before. When you secure the border, it's not just a wall, but a wall matters. You watch? Yes, yes, it is.
Thank you, guys.
Let's go vote.
So, can you say whether or not you support presidential emergency? You support it's hypothetical. And what you would express?
C-SPAN, where history unfolds daily. In 1979, C-SPAN was created as a public service by America's cable television companies. And today, we continue to bring you unfiltered coverage of Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court, and public policy events in Washington, D.C. and around the country. C-SPAN is brought to you by your cable or satellite provider.
Good evening from Washington, a live view of the North Portico entrance of the White House. In just a moment, President Donald Trump will deliver his first Oval Office address since being sworn in as our 45th president. He will be discussing border security, immigration, and his plans to construct a wall, or as he calls it now, steel barriers, to stop the flow of illegal immigrants from our southern border. As way of background, Herbert Hoover was the first president to use the Oval Office to address the American people. Richard Nixon used it the most, 43 times during his presidency. President Trump wants to build the case for a wall, and it comes on day 18 of a partial government shutdown, with both Democrats and Republicans refusing to budge so far. Following his address, the Democratic response from the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Paul Ryan. In just a moment, you'll hear from the president. I want to share with you a couple of tweets from Josh Hawley, new senator, Republican from Missouri. Just cast my first vote in the U.S. Senate to protect our great ally Israel. Dems voting no won't let Senate work because they want to punish President Trump for seeking more border security. And there's this from Senator Marsha Blackburn. I just cast my first vote in the U.S. Senate. Look forward to watching the president's Oval Office address. Another tweet from Democratic Congressman Joe Kennedy. He has lied about who's paying for it. you are. He's lied about who's arriving at our border, asylum seekers and terrified families. He's lied about who supports it, no former presidents. He has lied about why we need it. We won't. Tonight will be no different. And finally, this from Senator Bernie Sanders. There is no border crisis. The real crisis, those 800,000 people who don't know how they will pay their mortgages, student loans, and put gas in their cars. In just a moment, the president addressing the nation from the Oval Office. Your reaction later tonight.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. But all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico. Women or children are the biggest victims, by far, of our broken system. This is the tragic reality of illegal immigration on our southern border. This is the cycle of human suffering that I am determined to end. My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe, in fact, safer than ever before. The proposal from Homeland Security includes cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy. Our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. this barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense. The border wall would very quickly pay for itself. The cost of illegal drugs exceeds $500 billion a year, vastly more than the $5.7 billion we have requested from Congress. The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico. Senator Chuck Schumer, who you will be hearing from later tonight, has repeatedly supported a physical barrier in the past, along with many other Democrats. They changed their mind only after I was elected president. Democrats in Congress have refused to acknowledge the crisis, and they have refused to provide our brave border agents with the tools they desperately need to protect our families and our nation. The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation. But the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government. This situation could be solved in a 45-minute meeting. I have invited congressional leadership to the White House tomorrow to get this done. Hopefully, we can rise above partisan politics in order to support national security. Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside. The only thing that is immoral is the politicians to do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. America's heart broke the day after Christmas when a young police officer in California was savagely murdered in cold blood by an illegal alien who just came across the border. The life of an American hero was stolen by someone who had no right to be in our country. Day after day, precious lives are cut short by those who have violated our borders. In California, an Air Force veteran was raped, murdered, and beaten to death with a hammer by an illegal alien with a long criminal history. In Georgia, an illegal alien was recently charged with murder for killing, beheading, and dismembering his neighbor. In Maryland, MS-13 gang members who arrived in the United States as unaccompanied minors were arrested and charged last year after viciously stabbing and beating a 16-year-old girl. Over the last several years, I've met with dozens of families whose loved ones were stolen by illegal immigration. I've held the hands of the weeping mothers and embraced the grief-stricken fathers. So sad, so terrible. I will never forget the pain in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, and the sadness gripping their souls. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? To those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. This is a choice between right and wrong, justice and injustice. This is about whether we fulfill our sacred duty to the American citizens we serve. When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country. And that is what I will always do. So help me God. Thank you and good night.
The president in his first primetime Oval Office address to the American people. He will be followed up by tonight's speech with a visit Thursday along the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas, where he will build on his case for a wall, a barrier, as he put it, a steel barrier to stop the flow of illegal immigrants. Tomorrow, the president will travel to Capitol Hill. He will meet with Senate Republicans. Earlier today, Vice President Mike Pence meeting with House Republicans, urging them to, quote, stand strong with the president in his demand for $5.7 billion to fund the wall. In about 2.5 minutes, you will hear the Democratic response. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they will deliver their remarks from the Speaker's hallway inside the U.S. Capitol. Speaker Pelosi will begin, followed by Senator Schumer. In the prepared remarks released just a moment ago, Speaker Pelosi saying that the president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts, and they will outline their facts as they see them with regard to the wall. The president also confirming just a moment ago that they will be back at the White House tomorrow mid-afternoon for a 3 o'clock session, another meeting with the president, the vice president, and top Democratic and Republican congressional leaders. That meeting will take place in the Situation Room at the White House. Now, all of this comes as Senate Democrats used another procedural move, essentially blocking a bipartisan foreign policy bill, telling Senator Mitch McConnell that they will not move on anything until the government reopens. Now, some in Congress are urging the president to declare a national emergency in order to sidestep lawmakers and proceed with the border wall. Early reports is the president indicating tonight that he will not do that, but it does remain an option. And while political leaders in Washington lay down the marker on the issue, an estimated 803,000 federal workers are impacted, half of them furloughed without pay. If this extends, by the way, beyond Friday, it will become the longest federal government shutdown ever. The previous longest shutdown was in December of 1995 during the Clinton administration, lasting 21 days. A live view of the U.S. Capitol and the North Portico at the White House. Our phone lines will be open following the Democratic response, which will begin momentarily. You can begin dialing at 202-748-8920. That's our line for Democrats, and 202-748-8921 for Republicans. If you're an independent, 202-748-8922. Very quickly, this is from Senator Marco Rubio, a tweet saying Senate Democrats deciding to put shutdown politics ahead of support for Israel by voting against beginning debate on our Senate Bill 1. And another tweet from a Democratic lawmaker, Pat Leahy of Vermont. The president may not care about the impact his shutdown is having on millions of Americans, but the Senate must. Stoking fear through misinformation in order to promote his political agenda is simply wrong. We'll have a live view of the U.S. Capitol, and in just a moment, the Democratic response by Speaker Pelosi and the Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer.
Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to the American people tonight about how we can end this shutdown and meet the needs of the American people. Sadly, much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts. The fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. But the president is rejecting these bipartisan bills which would reopen government over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall, a wall he always promised Mexico would pay for. The fact is, President Trump has chosen to hold hostage critical services for the health, safety, and well-being of the American people and withhold the paychecks of 800,000 innocent workers across the nation, many of them veterans. He promised to keep government shut down for months or years, no matter whom it hurts. That's just plain wrong. The fact is, We all agree we need to secure our borders while honoring our values. We can build the infrastructure and roads at our ports of entry. We can install new technology to scan cars and trucks for drugs coming into our nation. We can hire the personnel we need to facilitate trade and immigration at the border. We can fund more innovation to detect unauthorized crossings. The fact is, the women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government. Thank you. Leader Schumer.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. My fellow Americans, we address you tonight for one reason only. The President of the United States, having failed to get Mexico to pay for his ineffective, unnecessary border wall, and unable to convince the Congress or the American people to foot the bill, has shut down the government. American democracy doesn't work that way. We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage. Tonight, and throughout this debate and throughout his presidency, President Trump has appealed to fear, not facts, division, not unity. Make no mistake, Democrats and the president both want stronger border security. However, we sharply disagree with the president about the most effective way to do it. So, how do we untangle this mess? Well, there's an obvious solution. Separate the shutdown from arguments over border security. There is bipartisan legislation supported by Democrats and Republicans to reopen government while allowing debate over border security to continue. There is no excuse for hurting millions of Americans over a policy difference. Federal workers are about to miss a paycheck. Some families can't get a mortgage to buy a new home. Farmers and small businesses won't get loans they desperately need. Most presidents have used Oval Office addresses for noble purposes. This president just used the backdrop of the Oval Office to manufacture a crisis, stoke fear, and divert attention from the turmoil in his administration. My fellow Americans, there is no challenge so great that our nation cannot rise to meet it. We can reopen the government and continue to work through disagreements over policy. We can secure our border without an ineffective, expensive wall. And we can welcome legal immigrants and refugees without compromising safety and security. The symbol of America should be the Statue of Liberty, not a 30-foot wall. So our suggestion is a simple one. Mr. President, reopen the government and we can work to resolve our differences over border security, but end this shutdown now. Thank you.
Live from the U.S. Capitol and the Democratic response by the two Democratic leaders, Chuck Schumer of New York and the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, urging the president to reopen the government and then resume negotiations on the border wall. We should point out in a meeting with reporters earlier in the day, the president telling reporters he would not go along with that. He will continue with the shutdown, feeling he has the upper hand in negotiations. So we want to hear from you. Tell us what you think about the president, his remarks, his first Oval Office address, as well as the Democratic response from the Speaker's Hall in the House of Representatives. 202 is the area code here in Washington, D.C. The numbers will continue to be on the bottom of the screen. 748-8920 is our line for Democrats, and 202-748-8921 for Republicans. All others, 202-748-8922. Some reaction from members of Congress. We'll begin with Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas. Well said by the President of the United States. Shame on those scoring political points instead of solving problems. And there's this from Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. At no point did President Trump address why we cannot reopen parts of the government that have nothing to do with border security. Why is he holding the State Department, the Justice Department, Commerce, Department of Transportation, and the National Park Service and Americans that they serve hostage? Another response from Republican Senator Ron Johnson. The president made a strong case for securing our border and fulfilling our responsibility to protect fellow Americans. Time to end the politics and properly fund border security. And then finally, from Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, the president said nothing in his address to justify holding 800,000 federal workers hostage. These hardworking public servants, their families, and the American people deserve better. On to your phone calls from Pasadena, California, our line for Independence. Good evening.
Yes, hi, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm a son. I'm a son of immigrants. Spanish was my first language. And my parents came to this country to flee the socialist and the communism that overtook many of these countries south of the border. And the people that come to this country, they come here to flee that, to flee the oppression, and that said, I just, my heart has always been with the immigrant, yet it is so important for us to know who and what is coming through our border.
We'll go to Fred next in Marianna, Florida, Republican line. What did you hear tonight, Fred?
I support the president. There is a crisis on the border. I welcome the people that come here legally. I know some. They're fine, wonderful people. The president is correct, and the previous caller is correct. We need to know who is coming here, and they come here legally. That's who want them to come here. And the Schumer and Pelosi, I might add, live behind walls. The elites in Washington live behind gated communities. Why can't we have a border or a gate, a wall on the border, like they have walls around their homes? And we support the president in Florida, and we need this wall, and the Democrats will never negotiate with him if he gives in and opens the government. He's got to hold something over their heads to make them negotiate. They refuse to come to the White House. He's offered to compromise. They did not even come there Monday or Tuesday, I believe. And I hope they come tomorrow and will compromise and meet with the president, because if they just give President Trump a chance, and I ask the American people to give him a chance, he is putting America first and trying to protect the American people.
Fred, thanks very much for the call. Sure, thank you. Again, the president will travel to Capitol Hill. He will meet with Senate Republicans, Vice President Pence meeting with House Republicans earlier today. And then, according to the White House schedule, at about 3 o'clock in the Situation Room at the White House, the congressional leaders, Democrats and Republicans, for their third session to discuss border funding, the wall. The president again saying he would be in favor of steel